Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith, Photog J the Great. During part 2 of my Sony A57 review, I asked you guys what sort of comparison you'd like to see next. I did a comparison not long ago between the Nikon D3200 and the Nikon D5100, and that's been very successful, and I feel like it's answered a lot of people's questions, so I figured doing more comparison videos would be a good thing. So after looking at the comments and kind of looking at what else YouTube has to offer already, I decided that I would go ahead and do a review comparing the Canon T4i, or the 650D as it's known in Europe, to the Sony SLT-A57. I have done a review on both of these cameras already, so I didn't shoot as many stills. However, one thing that I noticed that people are asking me a lot about is video capabilities. So for this comparison, I decided to put a lot of emphasis on video capabilities, especially since the Canon T4i is very innovative in that it's Canon's first model to offer autofocus in video mode. Anyways, we're going to start by looking at the specs. Let's see here. On the T4i, the T4i is an 18 megapixel DSLR, and we have the A57, which is 16 megapixels. So no real big difference there. Definitely not. I mean, 2 megapixels is definitely not anything to be really concerned about. As far as their ISO is concerned, both of these start out at a native ISO of 100. And let's see, it is interesting to note that both of these go up in full stops, so no third stops on these. The Sony goes up to a max of 16,000 ISO native, and then it has a boost setting that pushes it up to 25,600. And on the Canon, we have a native ISO that goes up to 12,800 with a boost that also pushes it up to 25,600. So pretty comfortable there. If you guys still kind of have more questions about how the image quality compares, unfortunately I didn't get to that today. Wow, and then a train goes by. Anyways, unfortunately I didn't get to that today, but I will come back and I'm gonna put together a little standard test scene, and I may shoot some high ISO shots between the two of them, but later on in this review we'll look at some lower ISO shots I did take today. Let's see here. One thing that is interesting to note, and this is kind of a Sony specific feature, we have compared Sony and well, we have talked about Sony's unique technologies in the past, but just to remind everyone, the Sonys use a stabilization system that's built into the camera body itself, as opposed to stabilization used in the lens like the Canon. So basically, anytime you put a lens on the Sony, you benefit from having stabilization, because what it does is it shifts the sensor up, down, left, right to compensate for shake, as opposed to shifting lens elements. So the nice thing about that is on some of the higher end lenses, they are a little bit less expensive on Sony, just because you don't have to have that extra stabilization mechanism built into the lens. So that's kind of nice, actually. Let's see, moving right along. Let's see. Oh yes, onto the screen. As you remember from my T4i review, I took a very in-depth look at how the touchscreen works on the T4i. So that's a unique feature, and just to remind everyone, it is a capacitive touchscreen, so it's just like the one on a modern smartphone. It's not like, you know, those old school touchscreens that a lot of other cameras have. So that's pretty neat as well. I am glad Canon left all the physical buttons intact, because those don't really work a touchscreen wouldn't work very well if you were shooting in the wintertime and you're wearing gloves or anything like that. So it is nice to know that you can do either or, buttons or touchscreen. Of course, the Canon is a optical viewfinder with 95% coverage. Most entry-level DSLRs, your viewfinder is pretty small, pretty dim. The Sony one is an electronic viewfinder as opposed to the optical path, which, once again, reminding everyone on that, Sony uses the translucent mirror technology. So basically their sensor is seeing through the mirror. That's what allows them to have faster autofocus in video mode, because they can still use the face detect sensors during that process. So that's kind of interesting. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. Let's see here. What else do we have here? The Canon does have a little bit higher resolution LCD screen. The Sony one is 921,000 dots. The Canon one is 1,040,000 dots. So a little bit sharper, a little bit crisper on the Canon. Having that electronic viewfinder on the Sony also means that it has 100% coverage of the frame, and so you're not going to miss out on anything there. So that's something that you typically only find on a higher end DSLR, but because of the unique electronic viewfinder design on the Sony, you can benefit from that on a DSLR at this level. So that's pretty cool as well. Let's see, anything else? Yes, on to video features here. This is where things start to get interesting. Right now, Sony is the only company that will allow you to shoot 60 frames per second in 1080p on a DSLR. Everything else can only do 60 frames a second whenever you drop down the resolution. So on the Canon, our 1080p frame rates are 30 frames, 25 frames, and 24 frames. And if you want to be able to get to 60 frames a second, you have to drop down to 720p. It also gives you the ability to shoot 50 frames per second in 720p as well. On the Sony, you can do, it is interesting to note that there isn't a 30 frame per second option, which, so what. But you do have the option of 60 frames per second and 24 frames per second in 1080. And let's see here. Its next lowest resolution is actually not 720. Okay, that's fascinating. There isn't a 720 option on it. You've got 1920 by 1080 resolution, or you've got 1440 by 1080 resolution at 30 frames a second. I think that has something to do with the way Sony's downsampling for the video mode works. The Canon sensors read off every other line. Sony does something a little bit different. Okay, and one thing that I mentioned in my A57 review is battery life. A lot of people complained about battery life on the Sony A55. It was a very, very innovative camera. But battery life was a little bit poor because of the electronic viewfinder. Sony, they have a smaller battery called the W series battery. The A57 though uses the larger M-type battery, so it's higher capacity. So on it, you get like 550 shots per charge, and the Canon is rated at 440 shots per charge. So pretty impressive actually, considering that the Sony is using an electronic viewfinder which uses more power. Oh yeah, I know what we forgot. We forgot to talk about continuous shooting speed and focus point system here. Let me back up a moment. Okay, on the Sony you've got 15-point autofocus system, and on the Canon you have a 9-point autofocus system. Canon, they love that 9-point AF system. But I guess if it's not broke, then, no point in fixing it. And one of the other main advantages of the Sony DSLRs is that because of that translucent mirror, they're able to shoot at a much, much higher frame rate, which is pretty cool if you're shooting any type of sports. On the Canon, you're looking at 5 frames per second at the full 18 megapixel resolution. On the Sony, you can do up to 12. However, the only downside of that is it can't do so at its max resolution. If I recall, it's about I believe it's about an 8 megapixel image that it does whenever it's shooting at its max 12 frames per second. Still very, very impressive. Whenever you're shooting in that max continuous burst mode on the Sony, you do also have a 1.5 crop ratio that's applied because basically the camera reads just the center part of the sensor to allow it to shoot faster. So it is kind of neat because you get a little bit extra reach out of the camera as well. Okay, that's enough specs right now. We're going to take a look at both these cameras side by side, and then I'll show you some samples. Now we can see both of the bodies closer up. I will go ahead and point out that I did do all the testing on the T4i with the 18-135 STM lens. Last time, whenever I did the full review of the T4i, I didn't have that lens, and I used the 40mm STM instead. But I'm finally happy that I got my hands on this lens to test. I'm going to point out a couple things on that too real fast. Let's see, get ourselves focused here. I did notice immediately that they put a lock switch on this lens that the regular 18-135 does not have. But all in all, it looks pretty much the same. It's the standard 18-135. Even on its name up there, it still says IS 18-135. It's not until you look at the front of the lens that you realize it's the STM version. So anyways, I thought I'd point out that real fast. But of course, looking at the back of the camera here, I'm not going to go over just a whole lot of stuff on this. We already went over the full camera in the full review on it. But of course, it is a touchscreen. And one other thing that they changed on the Canon now is that you have a nice selection for your video mode up here now, so you don't have to go through all the settings on the dial, so that's nice. Both these cameras are about the same size actually. I do like the grip a little bit better on the Sony. You can see how the Canon is a little bit smaller. On the Sony here, it just fits my hand. Oops, just whack the Canon. As you can see here, the Sony kind of fits a little bit better in my hands, so I like that. The swiveling screen on both of these is nice. The Sony is not a touch screen. On the Sony, you've got your screen, it swivels down at the bottom like this. I do like the way this Canon screen swivels better. Just because on this one, whenever you go down like this, if you happen to have your camera on a tripod, well, of course, the socket is right there. So whenever you turn the screen, you can't really do this with it on a tripod because you would, bump the screen into the tripod there. So I do like the Canon design a little bit better as far as that goes. Right now, I am really wishing that my D7000 had a swiveling screen. Seems like every time I do a review, I wish that it did, because I end up with the camera in a weird position. So having a swiveling screen for video is very nice. But yeah, I do like the Canon design a little bit better because it comes out this way. As far as ports and connections go, both of these cameras are pretty similar. On the Canon, you have your microphone jack and your remote jack right under this little cover here. So that's nice. Then you've got your analog, AV out, and your HDMI right here. Okay. The Sony does have a DC in, which, so what? Probably wouldn't use that a whole lot these days, but I don't know if you're shooting in a studio or something, that could be good. You've got your remote connection right up here on it. And then USB and HDMI over on this side. And then, of course, you've got your microphone right up here. Now, of course, I said this. There's another video I made that you guys may want to check out that goes into a lot more details on the video capabilities of the Sony. But it's called Sony DSLR Video Revisited or something like that I called it. Anyways, I'll put a link to it here. But in that video, I note several of the video capabilities of the Sony. One thing that I do not like about Sony in terms of video capabilities is the fact that on the Sony right now it's not possible to manually adjust your audio levels in video mode. So if you're really serious about video, my recommendation between these two cameras would actually be the Canon. Because if you're wanting to have more control, you're going to want to be able to manually adjust your audio levels and things like that. On the Canon, there's one other thing that makes a difference as well. If you're in the video mode, let's see here. Okay, I'm in the video mode here, and I'm going to go into manual exposure mode here. You can see that it's possible for me to adjust shutter speed, and I can also adjust my ISO like that, and I can also adjust my aperture as well. Now, while you'll notice, let's see here, I'm going to bump this up a little bit so you guys can see the screen better. Okay, while you'll notice that, of course, this dial is making a lot of clicking, the actual lens is not making a lot of noise as I change my aperture setting here. So let's see, I'm going to stop down. So the little clicking that you do here is the dial. It's not coming from the lens. And it is also possible for me to be able to adjust the aperture setting without having to have the camera on or have the lens on manual focus. Now I can do the exact same thing on the Sony. I'm going to flip it over to video mode. And as I showed you in that Sony DSLR video, video, you actually have to put the camera over to manual focus like this if you want to be able to adjust any of the settings. So there's an option up here in the menu, and now that I have the lens, or now that I have the camera on manual focus, I can go in here and I can actually adjust. I can set this down to manual exposure mode like that. And now I can do the same thing I can do on the Canon in terms of adjusting shutter speed and aperture and all that. The iris does make a lot of noise though as I change this, so that's what I'm going to show you now. So you can hear the lens making quite a lot of noise there as it's adjusting. So yeah, basically on Sony lenses, they're basically like Nikon lenses. The aperture is controlled mechanically. On Canon, the aperture is controlled electronically. So everything on a Canon lens is electronic. On Nikon and Sony, you've got electronic communication for VR and focus and things like that. But the actual opening and closing of the lens is done mechanically. So you end up with this clicking sound. So that's kind of a downside. So I'm going to show you guys a example of how the focusing works on both of these cameras, because as we know, the Canon is the first one, or the Canon T4i is the first Canon that does autofocus in video mode. I'm going to show you guys that next, but before I do, I'm going to go ahead and give my conclusion. If you want a camera to shoot video, and you're going to be doing like more creative type video. You're going to do like maybe a short film, or maybe you're a photographer and you want to integrate some stills into your some video into your existing stills, and you really want to have more creative control. Then I'm going to say that the Canon is going to be the better way to go, because you've got more options. You know, you can plug in your microphone, you can have full control of your audio levels. It's easier to be able to change your settings as far as aperture, shutter speed, that sort of thing. So it's definitely going to be much better to go with the Canon if you're doing that. If, however, you want to get a very good quality DSLR, and maybe video isn't your primary concern, or maybe you just, you know, kind of see yourself doing video more occasionally, I would say that's kind of where the Sony comes in. The only thing that the Sony has going for it that the Canon doesn't in terms of video is the 60 frame per second option. But other than that, it just doesn't. It doesn't do quite as well if you're wanting to do manual controls. It does have faster autofocus in video, as you'll see in the clips that I'm about to show you. But you know, if you're wanting more control, the Canon is going to be better for that. And of course, if you're doing any type of short films, any type of cinematography or anything like that, you probably don't give a crap about autofocus anyway, because you're going to be setting up all your shots and you're going to be manually focusing, you know, as it is. So that's basically my conclusion on that. If you want something that's going to be easier to use, you know, more camcorder-like, that's where the Sony comes in. If you want more creative control in video, go more along the lines of the Canon. If anyone has any questions, as usual, just write me in the comments below. As time goes on, we may revisit both these cameras, and I'll do some more kind of high ISO type shots, things like that. But I kind of wanted to focus on the video in this video. Until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, Photog J the Great, signing off.